So if you boys and girls would like to take a little note out of one of these pockets, and then we'll go around the circle reading our notes. This is just a little trivia about interesting people on our family tree. Probably falls away from me.
Okay, grab one of the notes.
Very good.
Do I look at my boys and girls too? Like
Oh, sure you do.
Okay, let's see if I get my glasses out.
You bet. Venice and I have been pals since before we started first grade together. Since we were in the same, okay, we were in the same ward, so we had a long and happy friendship. Well, now, my story tonight will be basically about 3 homes which we have restored, which tie into the Thorn family. And maybe I should show you in the first place how we are related to one another. I have prepared some papers to give you, and it shows how you date back to William Thorn. And there's one for every one of Jim and Joyce's children. I've given you 1 or 2, so you can just pass it right along.
Thank you.
And your names are at the bottom there.
Thank you.
Others for you to take home to the family.
Well,
Let me let you read it anyway, because they're for
look at while you
for the family. Let me
I'll
show
borrow
you
one
that.
for a minute.
Sure.
Okay.
If you'd like to look at one. We are all thorns. And starting from the bottom and going up to the top, let's start at Michael and Hal and Scott and Carlin. You see where their names are here. Then we go up to Jim and Joyce. Then their parents are Harold and Marie. And of course, Venice is a sister to Harold. And Harold's mother is Harriet Johnson Whiting. Her mother is Harriet Thorn Johnson. And Harriet Thorn Johnson is a sister to Abner Thorn. She was the only sister in the Thorn family of brothers. And Jim showed me a wonderful large photograph. This is a copy of what Marie sent to the newspaper in an article about the Thorns. But you see, I can pass this around if you'd like to see it closely, although his is better. So that's where we are tied in. But then we are all descended from Richard Thorn Jr., who was the LDS pioneer who came to Springville, Utah. And all of the Thorns in Springville relate or descend from Richard Thorn Jr.
I have one of those packets.
Yes. Yes. You're welcome to take that one, Marie.
Don't you need
And
to look?
no, I don't need any further. That shows you several more links to get back into the ancestry of the Thorns, back to our immigrant ancestor, William Thorn. They're on the top line, and he is the earliest ancestor that I know about, but he is the one who came from England, and he came to New England in the 1630s. A number of our people have been possessed of highly religious opinions. Sometimes their religious thoughts have gotten them into a little difficulty if they didn't agree with the prevailing religion in the colonies, and such was the case with our man William Thorn, the earliest ancestor. He lived in Lynn, Massachusetts, and was banished from the town, and that means tossed to the wolves in the 1630s, because he denied the right of the Puritan Church to baptize infants. And he was right, wasn't he? According to our restored gospel, children are born pure and do not need infant baptism. But anyway, he was forced to leave the town of Lynn, Massachusetts in 1638, and he went over into the Dutch-held territory of Long Island. And he was one of the 18 men who applied for a patent for the town of Flushing, Long Island, New York.
That's where I live.
And that's where
Harold and I
Marie and
lived there.
Harold were.
Now, was Harriet born there, Grandma?
What?
Was Harriet born in Flushing?
Yes.
Well, I was up to the up to the Salt Lake Library on one occasion, and this map was just sitting out on a table waiting for me to find it. And here is a map of Flushing, Long Island, New York, drawn in, I think it's 1665. Anyway, these little squares are the homes in
Harold's
Flushing in
grandmother.
1665. So our man, William Thorn, has to be represented here. And we
They
know
were the
that,
first ones.
another man that I want to tell you about, named John Bound, who built a home there in 1661, must be
That'd be
represented.
Adna. Harold and I walked past that home nearly every time we went to
Is
the
that
subway.
right? Well,
Never knew
that he was a
that he
direct
was a
ancestor.
relative.
Well, I didn't either, Marie, until I got into this. So anyway, I do want to tell you a little about these interesting people tonight. And I want to give you a chance to read your little stories. I guess I started to tell us why we are here and why we are related. And I wanted to tell you we all descend from Richard Thorn Jr. Now, Richard Thorn and his wife, Harriet Anna Glines Thorn, were endowed and sealed in the Nauvoo Temple, which is quite unusual because that temple was only open a matter of a few weeks from the early part of December until the middle of February. And so here is the temple record of Richard Thorn and Harriet Anna Glines Thorn, where I have the yellow marker. And so they took part in the LDS chapter in Nauvoo and took part in the Exodus. And then they, being very providential people, prepared themselves over in Iowa. And they camped in Iowa for several years and did not come west until 1853. And their son, Abner Thorn, who is my ancestor, was born while they were camped in what was called Pigeon Creek, not far from winter quarters.
Is that on your maternal side?
And my mother is a Thorn and her mother is a Clyde, so I'm related to all the Thorns and Clydes of Springville. But here is a map of where Pigeon Creek is in Iowa, where Abner was born. Salt Lake City, or the valley of Great Salt Lake, looked like this when our people came in 1853, so I'll pass these pictures around. And Salt Lake City was very, very young at that point, and not very many buildings. So that kind of shows us where we are related with the Whitings and Phyllis here. Now, should we go around the circle and you could read your little tidbit? And these tidbits will not be about any one particular family, but just different Thorn relatives. Okay, go ahead,
Did
dear.
you know Elizabeth, is it pronounced Phones?
Yes, Phones, F-O-N-E-S.
Elizabeth Phones married her own first cousin, Henry Winthrop. So her uncle, Governor John Winthrop, became her father-in-law.
Yes, and that story is here, and there is a novel written about the lady Elizabeth Phones Winthrop. Fee Callett. The lady had 3 husbands, eventually. Okay. Maybe I picked one up. That is, maybe this is yours. I did pick one up. Okay.
Because did you know our very distant relative, the husband of a descendant of our direct ancestor John Bone, DeWitt Clinton, was mayor of New York City for 12 years, then twice governor of New York, promoted the building of the Erie Canal, and went on to run for president of the United States. He lost his bid to James Madison for president.
Yes, the Erie Canal is called Clinton's Folly, and that was our man, DeWitt Clinton. Of course, it proved not to be a folly at all, but to be very productive.
And three of his wives were fortunate.
And another temple.
Direct ancestor John Bone
Bound, any way you want to say it's all right with me.
was the only man exiled through religion by the government of New Netherlands. It was long ago when the Dutch owned New York, and it was called New Netherlands.
Very good.
Did you know that we have a photo of our DA Adam Winthrop, who lived in 1498?
Good. The DA means to me direct ancestor. If I've written relative, it means it's the brother or some son or something, but DA would mean a direct ancestor who lived in 1498. So I thought that was quite fun to find a picture, which I'm going to show you. I have a set of slides to show you, and I'll tell you the stories while we see the slides. Okay?
Okay.
Hal?
Did you know that our direct ancestor's house, the John Bound,
I call it.
the John Bound house, is the oldest house in New York City. It still stands. It was built in 1661. It is listed as a tourist attraction in the NYC.
Yes, I have a little map of just a couple of years ago here, which showed the Bound house on the map of things to see.
Marie, is it marked so you know it's the Bound house?
Yes.
As you go by, you can tell.
But it's marked now. It may not have been, Marie, when you and Harold were there.
The what?
Did you
The
know?
Bound house
That's
is
where
marked
the-
now.
that's
I think
where-
it became,
No, it wasn't marked.
it wasn't marked.
Uh-uh.
I think it was put on the national, what is it, Register of Historic Houses in
I'm not sure.
1945, I think. So it may not have been marked in your era.
I'm sure it wasn't marked,
Yes.
but I can see the house as plain as
Is that
can
right?
be.
That's interesting.
It was one of the big houses along that
Uh-huh.
boulevard.
Okay. Well, who would be next? Michael?
Did you know our direct ancestor Adam Winthrop lived during the time of King Henry VIII and of Queen Elizabeth I of England? Adam and his wife had a son, Thomas, born in June of 1533. On the day of Anne Boleyn became Queen of England.
Yes, I thought that was interesting. That ties you into a moment in history when Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn. Our ancestor had a child born on that day.
And she's the one that lost her head.
Yes, she is.
Did you know Richard Thorn's cane? I thought you meant Richard Thorn, the one we know here in Salt Lake, or in Springville. Is this Richard Thorn, one of these, the 1741?
Let's see. Richard Thorn Jr. would be our man who came he would be the 1825, Richard Thorn Jr. would be the LDS pioneer who came to Springville,
Okay.
and all of us descend from him.
Okay. So it's his cane. And Harriet Anna Thorn's honey dish
Oh,
are
yes.
on display at the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum.
Yeah, that's right. So when you go into Salt Lake, you can look for the Utah County case, and if you forget where it is, there's all that's computerized now, and they can just look at their computer and tell you what artifacts they have about that relate to your ancestors. Well, the grandmother, Harriet Anna Glines Thorn, had a honey dish the shape of an old-fashioned flat iron, and this is not the honey dish, but the original is in the Salt Lake DUP Museum, and Mama, my mother, saw a honey dish that looked very much like her grandmother's and bought it. So if any of you would like this old-fashioned candy in the honey dish, you're just very welcome to have some. Very good.
Oh, did you make it?
Oh no, these are just conference mints.
Because that
There, I can
honey
pass the
candy
lid too.
used to be like taffy.
Oh yes,
We
you
used
could
to pull it.
pull that. Okay, do you want to read another trivia bit?
I never got one.
Oh, you didn't? Sorry. If you want to choose one, you're welcome to.
Let's see here. Did you know our relative Elisha Nelson owned a boat which was sailing on the Hudson River on the very day Robert Fulton's first steamboat, the Clermont, made its maiden voyage? The engine made such a big noise that the people were frightened. They thought it was the devil coming up the river.
So our ancestor was alive when Robert Fulton's steamboat was coming up the river. Then would you like to read your little paper, please?
Did you know that Eric Glines, brother to our Harold, Harriet Ann Glines Thorn, served as an advanced scout in Brigham Young's very first company to come to the Salt Lake Valley in 1847.
Yes, he's named on 5 different pages in Clayton's journal regarding the coming of the pioneers in Brigham Young's first company, and he shot a buffalo and was quite an adventurous fellow. Brigham Young had to shake his finger at him in one place, though, because he didn't want to obey. He wanted to do something else from what Brigham Young asked him to do.
What was that story?
Well, should I really confess?
Sure.
When they got out as far as Casper, Wyoming, they built a ferry to carry the covered wagons across the river, and it was a money-making affair because so many people were traveling on the Oregon Trail, which was located in a similar way, that our pioneers had an opportunity to make money by charging $1 a ferry per covered wagon to ferry them across the river. So they did that for 2 or 3 days, and our man, Eric Glines, wanted to stay and operate the ferry. But Brigham Young assigned 2 or 3 other men. Well, Eric Glines disobeyed and stayed back anyway for 2 or 3 days and helped operate the Mormon ferry. And then I guess his conscience got the better of him, because Brigham had said when he got the word, "The Lord demands an obedient people." And anyway, Eric made his way alone and caught up with the LDS Pioneer Company after disobeying Brigham Young. But anyway, he was an advanced scout, and Aunt Margaret Miner, who is, well, she was a Johnson with
Harold's mother's sister.
Yes, that's how it would be.
That was Lucille.
And Zina's sister.
Yes. She said that Eric Glines is represented on the This Is a Place monument in Salt Lake at the mouth of Immigration Canyon. And of course there are statues there relating to that first entry into the valley. Well, very good. Let's move on to the next one, and then I'll show you my slides.
Linda, are you still there?
I didn't know.
He's headed for the stairs.
Shut me there. Where's my...
Yes, that'll be fine.
Did you know Ancestor Anthony Badgley's income tax was paid with 23 pounds of bacon, 6 bushels of wheat, and 1 bushel of Indian corn?
That would be interesting to pay your tax with Indian corn, wouldn't it? And I've forgotten the year of that, in the 1700s.
1711.
Yes, okay. Do you have one you'd like to read?
Yeah, the one I have is about the endowment in Nauvoo Temple.
Oh, in the Nauvoo
Richard
Temple.
and Harriet Ann Glines Thorn.
Okay. Marie, did we give you a little trivia or
No.
not? Well, we'll give you one and then move on. Do you want to take one out of the exit pocket? Jim could too as well.
Did you know Robert and Elizabeth Peake bought all the land between 2 small rivers from the Indians for the price of 25 British redcoat uniforms? Now that would be where?
And that is in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I have a slide to show you Elizabeth's land. Our direct ancestor is Elizabeth Phones, and she's on this chart too. I'll tell you that in a minute. And anyway, last summer I had the fun of going to see her land, which she bought from the Indians. And it was carried in her own name for over 100 years as Elizabeth's Land, or Elizabeth's Point. And even there is a map in the Independence Hall in Philadelphia which shows that peninsula of land in her name as Elizabeth's Point.
That's Thorn, F-O-N-E-S.
F-O-N-E-S. I can tell it to you right here. That was kind of be the be. Let's let Jim say his though, and then I'll get started here.
Did you know Hannah Bone Franklin Osgood, a descendant of our direct ancestor John Bone, resided over one of the stateliest mansions in New York City? This house later became the first executive mansion of our first United States President, George Washington.
Yes, I wrote to the Historical Society or somebody to see if I could find the location of the mansion house where George Washington spent his nearly a first year in office. That was the original White House, in effect, which was rented from a distant relative of ours. And they told me that I could go down into the catacombs under the one of the bridges. It seems like it was on the Manhattan side, of course, of one of the famous bridges in New York City. And of course that the man was kind of joking in the letter he replied to me, but that would have been the location in that early era when George Washington became president of the country. But I might say that our John Bound, whose home is in Flushing, Long Island, and his story I was basically wanting to tell you mainly tonight, he has descendants who have been very politically active in the country and very prominent. And that was why one of his descendants married a politically high-ranking man, and so that was why his mansion was used as the first White House for George Washington. So, well, so much for the little trivia. If we've given each one of you a chance to read yours. We have a novel written by Anya Seton. I keep walking out of your film, but then that's all right with me. The Winthrop Woman is a novel which received a lot of acclaim in the 50s. It became the book of the year for the Reader's Digest in 1958, and it was a very popular historical novel. The woman was a highly respected novelist, Anya Seton. She passed away only 3 or 4 years ago, I was told. But anyway, she has written quite a number of historical novels, and she claimed that everything in her novel was factual, and she had only put the meat on the bones, she said. But it has been a very fascinating book to me, and it is still available. It's probably in every library. I have rented it from Springville and Provo Library. I did send away through a bookstore and bought books for my children when I discovered this. But this gives all this ancestry. It is really a ready-made story of our
where she is on it.
Yes, here is Elizabeth. She's the leading lady in the Winthrop Woman novel. And she, let's see, I was going to show you where she comes in, but we are coming up the list through the Thorns. You come up to where you have a Joseph Thorn marrying Mary Bound, nearly to the top, just right under William Thorn. And the Bound ancestry is, that's where that ties in. Now, the parents of John Bound's wife would be our ancestor Robert Feek and Elizabeth Bones. But Elizabeth married her first cousin, Henry Winthrop, and her mother is Anne Winthrop, a sister to Governor John Winthrop. And so that's how we get into this Winthrop line. But even in addition to that, Elizabeth married her first cousin, which was quite common in the 1600s. And so her uncle becomes her father-in-law. And her uncle, Governor John Winthrop, who led the Puritans to the Boston area, the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, he controlled her throughout her life, and she was a rather rebellious girl about that fact. But Henry died within the first year or two of their marriage. And in fact, he came over to America with his father's fleet of 17 ships in landing in July of 1630. And he and 3 friends saw an Indian canoe across the water there, the little bay, and he plunged into the water to swim to get the canoe to have a little fun, and he died of drowning in front of the 3 friends, neither of whom could swim. So he died the day he arrived in America. So here was our Lady Elizabeth over in England with Governor John Winthrop's wife. Both women were expecting new babies, and so their coming to America had to be delayed until the next year. So here was Elizabeth over there in England awaiting their child, and the young husband had already passed away. So she came to America the next year in early December of 1631, and by January, her father-in-law had her next husband all arranged for. And so she married our ancestor, Robert Feek, who was considerably older than herself, because her father-in-law had planned the marriage. Then later on, she married William Hallett, so the lady had 3 husbands eventually. Now, I wanted to show you the tie-in going back here then on the Winthrop line. The mother, our direct ancestor, is Anne Winthrop, the mother of Elizabeth, and Anne is a sister to Governor John Winthrop. And there is much written on the Winthrop family. In fact, I read somewhere that there are 50,000 pages of letter or manuscripts in existence relating to the Winthrop family. So there's much you can find out about the Winthrop people. So anyway, this little chart does tell the story of the Winthrop woman to a degree, mainly here, and then coming in this generation, that's supposed to represent the Bound house. Now, Hannah, who married John Bound, is the daughter of Our Lady Elizabeth here. And then their child is Mary Bound, and she marries Joseph Thorn, the son of, well, I guess we've got 2 Josephs before we get up to William Thorn. So anyway, all these people are on the Thorn line, and it's fascinating to read about their lives. Now, I do have some slides, and I thought I'd just tell you the story of 3, I can just stand on that. Oh yeah, I could, couldn't I? I'll show the slides and kind of tell you the story of the 3 homes that I wanted to tell you about. Oh, I need to move the chart. Jim and I planned to do that, didn't we, Jim? We put a little dab of tape in 2 places. And throw it over the back. I haven't disturbed it. There, thank you. I'll just flip it over here if that's all right.
You want me to turn out this light?
Heater, however.
Turn off that
Now,
one.
the first few slides will be relating to the Winthrop family, and the young children will probably encounter John Winthrop sooner or later. I don't know what year
Leave
the
this one
schools
on a minute.
teach about
Leave this one
colonial
on.
America. But this is the picture of the earliest ancestor that I'm aware of, having a picture of him. And the reason we have it is because he's a Winthrop. He is Adam Winthrop, the grandfather of Governor John. And having the famous Governor John in the family gives us this opportunity to find a direct ancestor of that era. Now, he lived in the days of Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, when costumes were so elaborate. And this man was a master clothier, and he was granted a whole village. He had what was called Groton Manor. He owned the whole village. The workers worked for him, and Henry VIII awarded him the village. So he must have been a very wealthy man. And it was due to the fancy clothing of the era. And last summer, well, in addition to last summer, I have had 3 excursions back to New England to see what I could see remaining of our family. And last summer I went to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they showed me the Winthrop Bible, which is said to belong to this Adam Winthrop, and it was silver metal, and it was just as if it were a book within a metal framework. It was just intricately done, very beautifully done. And that is the Winthrop Bible that had come down through the family. This is Governor John Winthrop, who led the Puritans here, and he was certainly not a Democrat, as the books say. He believed some men were born to lead and some were to follow, and he was born to lead. Anyway, he was a very strong-willed, very strict leader, but of course he accomplished a great deal of good, but he was very firm in his beliefs and very staunch in what he wanted to accomplish. Rather ruthless in some people's eyes. And this is another picture with the ruffle around the neck. That was the custom of the day. And this was his wife. Elizabeth called her Aunt Margaret. See, she would really have become her mother-in-law, but she was basically her aunt because Governor John was her mother's brother. But Margaret was as kind as her husband was firm, so they made a good team. Now this is a picture of Governor John on the ship Arabella, on the flagship of the fleet of 17 ships which came into New England in 1630. And this is a picture of the early, a map of the early New England locations, some of the earliest towns which were set out. I could, Dennis, if you want to run this, all you do is press your finger and I'll point to a thing or two when it comes along. Excuse me, boys. I'll move my chair back a little bit.
What am
Or I can be right here. Oh, I should have shown you
which
that little
buttons?
ditty.
The bottom?
This forward, this reverse.
Yeah, I've been pushing the forward.
Okay.
Yeah, and then wiggle this if it needs to be in focus a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to be in your way though, here, aren't I?
We're okay.
I just thought I would help us locate, there, I would help us locate Boston. If I can locate it myself, where are we here? Here's the Plymouth colony. Now the Pilgrims came to Plymouth in 1620, and my Sunday school genealogist feels like we will eventually tie into the Plymouth people, the Pilgrims, but I haven't seen it yet. But they didn't seem to mix one group to another, even though the others were here in such a short time later. Here is the Boston colony, and the Boston people first landed in the Salem area. That's where Henry Winthrop died of drowning, but they found better water supplies moving the colony down to this area. So this is Boston. You can move on, dear, please. This is a picture of the early people going to church, just to show you their clothing of the day. And this is their method of public humiliation for controlling, I was going to say delinquency, evil. Anyway, a thief or some person committing a crime would be put in the stocks or the pillories. I don't know which is which actually, but they are two different types of mechanisms that hold them fast, so passers-by can scowl at them and call them names or whatever and humiliate them. So that was the
They
method.
put the witches of Salem in there too.
Oh yes, they did. And this is, what would you guess this is?
It looks like something that they put over their face.
Yes, this is a gossip's mask. Now, if the wives gossip, that's the treatment they got. It seemed to be the wives that were doing the gossiping.
Even without a telephone.
Now, this is Governor John Winthrop Jr. This very strict father had a very loving son, John Jr. He's called Jack in the novel. And Elizabeth really loves Jack from childhood on. She could have married Jack. He ended up marrying her own sister, but she was rebellious and married his rebellious son instead. But Jack Winthrop, or Governor John Winthrop Jr., was very much loved, and he became governor of the colony of Connecticut throughout his lifetime. He was just much loved and greater popularity than his father had. And this is an older picture of Governor Jack, or John Jr. Now notice the wide-set dark eyes and the long nose with the bump in it. I've wondered if that's where my bump came from, but I've always worried about my bumpy nose. But apparently it's in the Winthrop family in a number of generations. And you might see the next one. The next one will be a picture of the wife of Governor John Jr. And the book said they didn't know whether it was his first wife, Martha Phones, sister to our Elizabeth, or his second wife. But she surely looks to be the first wife, Martha, if you compare the dark, deep-set wide eyes and the same nose, which has shown up in the Winthrop family. Oh, and the dimple in the chin. So anyway, she had those markings. She could or could not have been his first wife, who was Elizabeth's sister. Now we get into the story of Our Lady Elizabeth, Phones Winthrop Feek. Now she has married Robert Feek, and we descend from Hannah Feek, the oldest child of Robert and Elizabeth. Now see, Elizabeth has already had Henry's child and came over to America with the baby, and now has married Robert Feek, who was a goldsmith in London and a very well-to-do man. Oh, that's just fine, honey, that's just all right. And Elizabeth, though, you'll have to read the novel. Elizabeth does some rather risque things and brings public opinion against her, and she's even charged of witchcraft and has to leave her home by night. And so she and her husband come around the end of Cape Cod, like we were seeing on the map earlier. They just came around in a little ship and bought land from the Indians in what is now Old Greenwich, the old city of Greenwich, Connecticut, which is on the borderline of Connecticut and New York. Actually, it's only 25 miles or so from downtown Manhattan, New York. It's really very close. But this apparently was, in the little man in the boat, it doesn't matter, was said to be our Robert Feek. Yeah, this fellow in the boat and his neighbor, Daniel Patrick, the two of them came together and met the Indians on a rock there, and they bought land. But Elizabeth asked that she could have the land of the peninsula in her own name. And I thought that was quite a forward-looking woman to even want it in her own name in 1640. Imagine. So she was able to buy land, which is now written in the books of geography. You can find the titles of land back to the beginning, and it still shows that Elizabeth was the first owner of this land in Greenwich. So here they are meeting the Indians. They buy land, all the land between two rivers, for 25 British redcoat uniforms.
Where'd they get those uniforms?
Well, they must have picked them up along the way. I think it says something like that in the novel. They went armed with provisions and all. They meant to spend their life there. They were getting out from under the jurisdiction of Governor John Winthrop, her uncle, because she resented his authority over her throughout the novel. But she was a very courageous woman. Now it is said that some people feel that she was so rebellious and naughty that some of her descendants have slashed her name in the original records in the Massachusetts Historical Society. But she really did a great deal of good. Even to survive what she survived in that early day showed that she was a very vigorous woman. So they are buying the land at this point. Now, these are the Indian marks on the land deed, which is still in existence. And this is in the beginning of the story, a book about this history of Greenwich, Connecticut. And this is another picture of the writings. And these are the names of the Indians, the chiefs who signed for
They
their land.
could write.
Well, somebody's written anyway. I think those marks were the marks, but the people who came with John Winthrop were very highly educated, and they were very well-to-do people. They came with a great amount of provisions. They seemed to be well, they were a richer group than the Pilgrim people. I'm not saying anything derogatory about the Pilgrims, but they did come with money, and they were able to supply their own needs in a better way, easier way. This is the beginning, the preface to the Winthrop woman. Elizabeth was very beautiful with dark hair and dark eyes and a lovely appearance, and she brought her satins and her velvets from England to the wilderness. But you can kind of move along, and I'll try not to talk too much. But she is supposed to be one of the most misunderstood figures, according to this novelist, in American history. Fiery, beautiful, and proud. She fought religious intolerance. Anyway, she was a student of Anne Hutchison, if you've heard of her. That lady presented some religious viewpoints that Governor John Winthrop didn't care for, and so that put Our Lady Elizabeth on the blacklist because she sided with Anne Hutchison.
She was a feminist then.
Oh yes, she was in her day. I put that little picture in to show you the method of transportation. This is Elizabeth's family going to visit her grandfather, and look, they traveled in a little wooden wheeled cart in the early 1600s. And this is Governor John disciplining Elizabeth at an early day at the grandparents' home. There are the grandparents and all, but I don't want to give you too much of the story here, so we'll maybe move quickly through these. And Elizabeth, I guess this would be Elizabeth having an affair with Henry, the son of Governor John. And they smuggle in a slave from Jamaica. That's part of the story. You know, she's kind of disobeying all the way in the story. This is the ship and a terrible storm at sea. She prays to Heavenly Father the first time in her life, so she's apparently a rebellious girl as a young child. And here is Elizabeth on her own land. She's on the peninsula named Elizabeth's Point. And she has several Indian escapades. The author has tried to write the novel against the background of colonial America. And so these incidents are true. And she says that the family relates to the incident. So, now there were two very famous religious men who had a famous debate, and she witnesses that in the story. And here she's accused of witchcraft. The child's pointing a finger to Elizabeth, and they flee immediately through the night to get away from him. Here they are over in Connecticut, and her relatives desecrate an Indian grave, and that causes an Indian uprising. And here her daughter eventually marries a very immoral man, much older than herself, but he's by the name of John Underhill, but he's a very powerful man in early colonial America, and he causes the white people cause an Indian man to lead them to a village, and they massacre the village. And it was a terrible story, but it really happened, and our relative was the leader of it. It's really very infamous. Now, here is our Robert Feek. And Robert thinks he is losing his sanity and he must return to England. He thinks he has murdered a man in his goldsmith shop, but he has had signs of mental retardation for several years, so he leaves everything, the legal matters and money and silverware and all, in the hands of young Bill Hallett, a young neighbor, and he leaves the family in Bill Hallett's care. Well, Elizabeth by then is just recovering from having a child. She bears Robert 6 children, and our child is the oldest of the 6. And he goes back to England to make amends. Well, he never comes back. She doesn't hear from him for several years, and she eventually sets up a common law marriage with the neighbor who's in charge of her, Bill Hallett. And then Robert returns. So Elizabeth causes the scandal of the colonies, in the words of her Uncle John. He calls her his unregenerate niece. She couldn't be improved. And Peter Stuyvesant and his wife do give her a separation, or a bill of separation from her husband Robert Feek, who is our ancestor, so that she can marry Bill Hallett. Okay. Now, toward the end of the book, she comes back to her land and communes with nature, and she loves that land, and she's kind to the Indians. And she dies in the 1600s, and she even treats herself for a heart problem using digitalis. She raises foxglove flowers to treat herself. They're still using digitalis, I think.
Oh yes, they are.
Yes.
Get it from Foxglove.
Yes.
And I have some
Now,
foxglove
is
too.
that right? Oh, good.
Every time my doctor's son sees it, he says, "Oh, that's where we get our digitalis from."
Yeah. Well, this is a map in the upstairs room of the Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You get a reflection of the windows, which I didn't care for. I was trying to show that Elizabeth's land, which is right there, right by the borderline between New York. You see that line that goes up? On this side is Connecticut and this side New York. And it really still reads Elizabeth's land, or Elizabeth's Point, because that is a map of the country as it looked in 1775 and 76. And that's another one, but I don't think that's clear enough to worry about. Let's move on. Now, last August, I was able to stand on Elizabeth's land, so you know how exciting that was for me, and it is beautiful. And we drove down into the end of the peninsula, which becomes an island when the tide is, when the tide is high. Yeah. And so it was very lovely, and it is owned by the city of Greenwich now, but it did have a private owner until a few years ago. But it was called by Elizabeth's name. 2 or 3 shots here are the same land. And so there I had to go off the blacktop to be on their land now, didn't I? Okay. As Demp's for us, I seem to have had 2 slides of the same thing. That's the Winthrop Bible. And this is the opening page of Governor Winthrop's Massachusetts Journal. Now, Governor Winthrop made a day-to-day journal telling all the naughty things that anybody did from the day they arrived, and it's called the Bible of New England. And in last summer, they brought that out of the archives and showed us Volume 1, which began in 1630, and Volume 2. And it was even water speckled, but they said the ink on the paper was superior to what they use nowadays. So it was readable if you can read it. We said, my son said, "Oh, how can they read that?" And the woman said, "There are scholars who study this day after day. They can interpret it." So that was quite exciting. They showed us the Arabella bowl, a bowl used by the Winthrop family, and look, it's all chipped and had been cracked and mended. It was white and blue. The pattern was blue against the white pottery. It was made in Holland and used by the Governor John Winthrop family. Came over on the ship, and that was the Winthrop coat of arms granted. So, and then we found the burial places of several of the Winthrop family. They're right in the middle of Boston, right on the Freedom Trail. You can skip through these several of the similar things. Have I got that in backwards after all of my putting in? I do. Now we're through the Winthrops. Now we drove into the area of Deerfield. I think Deerfield's going to be next. Massachusetts, yes it is. And that was by a little monument that recorded an Indian fight where 243 Indians had ambushed 15 or so white men. Well, 3 of our relatives were in the fight, and one young boy, 15 years old, was the hero of the fight. He hid behind a log until the problem was past and then slipped back and got help. Anyway, that monument was telling about that. Now, Deerfield, Massachusetts is today a restored village, a mile long, a street a mile long, has a number of houses that have been restored. And our people, at least one branch of our people, lived in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Well, on the 29th of February, 1704, the French and Indians swooped down from Canada during the French and Indian War and burned all these little outlying settlements. And here's a picture from the Reader's Digest about it, or the National Geographic, or one magazine anyway. And they see, in some pictures you'll see French people working with Indians, and you can, there are pictures of this. That'll go a little bit better. Anyway, they took their tomahawks and broke down the door of the home and massacred the family inside. Well, one of our relatives, not a direct ancestor, but a relative, bought the old Indian house, as it was called, and made it into an inn and kept it until, over 100 years. It was in the Hoyt family. Now that's one of our Thorn lines. And so this door itself is in a museum there in Deerfield, Massachusetts. And there's a little boy, this came from the magazine, the little boy's peeking through the hole in the door.
His name is Whitey.
And this is an old picture of the Indian house. It's restored in a little grander way, as you'll see in a minute. But this is the restoration of the Indian house now. And it's supposed to be true to its size and all, but that was used as an inn. Now, our man, a brother to our direct ancestor by the name of David Hoyt, he and his family were captured by Indians during this terrible night and marched into Canada to be sold to the French. The French people offered $10 a live captive or $8 scalp, and so they just scalped him if they were too slow on the trail. But some of his family did not return, but several were able to return from captivity. But the poor father himself, that'll go a little plainer if you want to wiggle that other thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. But anyway, that shows the picture of the people being marched into Canada. And the father went, you can show me the next map, dear. Here we are at Deerfield when I find it. Here it is. It's on the Connecticut River. They were marched right up here, and then they went over to Lake Champlain and went in canoes up to, here's the St. Francis Village, is the village the Indians came from. And this Sorel is where they lived. Anyway, they eventually took them to Montreal and Quebec. But our poor fellow, David Hoyt, leaving Deerfield, went with a group up the river farther, and he died in Indian captivity of starvation in May or June after having been captured in late February at Coos Meadow. So I thought it was kind of fun to find a map that had Coos Meadow on it. That was apparently an Indian rendezvous house. Now this is called the Little Brown House on Albany Road in Deerfield, and it relates to the Hoyt family, but I haven't found that it's a very close association with us. And this is an old original building which is called the Wells Thorn home, and it looks prettier from the front, but we relate to the back part of the building, which was built by a Mr. Wells, who is a relative, not a direct ancestor, and he built that in something like 1715, as I recall. But notice how high the windows are. That's so the Indians can't climb in. And this is another shot. My boy took that shot, which I thought was very good. And they let the public enter through this little doorway, and every room is decorated in a later style. You know, you go from the real primitive area, as it was when our distant relative built it, to a more modern area. And you'll see that era, I mean. And this is what it looks like in the front, so that's very nice. Now, the lady who gave the home to the Deerfield Foundation was named Thorn Lucretia or something like that, and she gave that in 1915, so I have no idea whether or not we would tie into the last owner of the home before she gave it to the city. But inside the home are these different rooms. You can kind of move along with these, but they are they're beautifully done. And this is Mary Wells Williams, I think is her married name, and so she would be the daughter of a very distant relative. Now we come to another story, and we're to the Flushing, Long Island story. When William Thorn came to be one of the early proprietors of Flushing, Long Island, they applied to have freedom of religion in their town. They had it when in 1645 when they were given the first charter. But along came Peter Stuyvesant, the governor, and he did not care for Quakers. He said the Quakers were swarming all over Long Island, and he would put a stop to that. So he made a law that people had to subscribe to the Dutch Reformed Church, and anyone who worshipped in any group other than that was breaking the law. So these people are asking, petitioning for freedom of religion. This is the house John Bown and Hannah Feek, the daughter of our Elizabeth in the other novel, built in 1661. It must have been quite a lovely home in that era. They were prosperous farmers. He invited her friends to meet in their kitchen against the rule because he claimed freedom of religion from the first charter. Now this is a picture inside the house. And would you believe that the highboy, the chest of drawers, which is tall, called a highboy, was given John and Hannah by William Penn, the man who began the state of Pennsylvania. So this is from a picture, a commercial picture inside the building. And this is the kitchen where John invited his wife's friends to meet in this kitchen instead of out in the woods. And so now John was arrested because he broke the law, and he was sent over to Manhattan Island and put in the dungeon on bread and water and held in chains from September until the end of December. And then he still wouldn't say he wouldn't recant, the book said, and say he had done wrong, admit any wrong, because he staunchly held to the fact that he should have freedom of religion. So they sent him to Amsterdam to stand trial. And it took him about 2.5 years to get over there before he got home again. But in Amsterdam, the Dutch government, see, the Dutch were still holding Long Island, being a part of New York. It was called New Netherlands then. The Dutch vindicated our man John Bown and gave him a letter saying he could have freedom of religion in Flushing if he did not disturb the public peace of the town. And so they claim that freedom of religion in Flushing began in this kitchen because it was the source of John Bown's home. Now John Bown's home is still listed on the map. This is just a very recent map within the last year or two of things to see in New York City, and it is claimed to be the oldest house in New York. And now this is another story. So John and Hannah lived happily ever after. I should tell you that he held church in his kitchen for the next 40 years until the Quakers could afford to build a meeting house, which is still standing there now. And Hannah became a missionary for the Quaker religion, and she called herself on a mission and went to the British Isles and the Netherlands and preached the Quaker religion. We have the funeral service of her because the Quakers keep good notes of their meetings. Now this is a story about, you can back up that 1 minute. Now this is another story. This is another house we have belonging to a direct ancestor. This ancestor's name is John Whipple, W-H-I-P-P-L-E, and it is in Ipswich, Massachusetts, about 30 miles north of Boston and in the general area of Salem. And that house is as it was when it was built in 1642, as I'm recalling. And they have a little 17th century flower garden in front of the front door. We visited this last August on this same trip. You can move on now. This is showing the sidewalks. The little side or pathway walk was covered with crushed seashells, and my daughter-in-law Anne wanted to take a picture of the seashells, but it made a nice little pathway for walking. That may go plainer. Some of these are a little out of focus, it seems to me, but anyway, there are my boy and myself by the John Whipple house, and there are the flowers, just helter-skelter.
That's dill wheat.
Oh yes, it is dill, isn't it? A lot of the flowers we grow now. Okay, there are the kids. Okay. I was thrilled they were so interested in everything we saw. And this is, of course, on the National Register as well. Inside the house, they have a story for each room. There was no booklet put out. Now, the people were shipbuilders and the seamen in this area, and of course we know they would be in many parts of Massachusetts. And in the winter months, if they were not at sea, even the men made lace, and this is what they call pillow lace, and it was kind of like macrame. You remember a few years ago, everyone was tying knots and weaving macrame, and this would be the lace here, and these are the little spindles holding the different threads. And the man told us that the workers, while it was tedious and slow, still that was a legitimate source of income for the winter months. And this is a picture from a little card I got there of the John Whipple house.
That it?
Now that's it.
I'm impressed with all your dates and things you do by
Oh.
memory.
Oh, but
My
it's so
goodness
fascinating
sakes.
to me. I've just never had a hobby that was this much fun.
Wow.
So,
That's
so I
amazing.
hope it's interesting to others. And I've loved coming over tonight.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. When I told my